Welcome to Crime Documentary, where the darkest shadows of human nature are brought into the light. Tonight, we uncover the chilling tale of a man whose name still echoes in fear across South America. Pedro López, a figure shrouded in terror, became known as the Monster of the Andes, a predator who left behind a trail of unimaginable horror. His crimes earned him the title of the world's deadliest serial killer. And yet his story is far more disturbing than numbers can ever tell. This is not just a crime story, it is a descent into evil itself. Asterisk. The story of Pedro López begins in the dust-filled streets of Colombia, a place where poverty was not just an economic condition, but a way of life, an environment that shaped the fate of countless children who had no choice but to survive on scraps and instinct. Born in 1948 in a world already hostile to him, López never experienced the warmth of a family that could nurture or protect him. His mother was a sex worker, hardened by her own struggles and indifferent to the tenderness that a child so desperately needs. For López, home was not a place of comfort but of cruelty, where neglect and violence were his earliest teachers. The absence of love, coupled with the presence of constant abuse, carved into his soul a bitterness that would later erupt in unspeakable ways. His childhood was a cocktail of fear, confusion, and loneliness, and each passing day pushed him closer to the shadows that would one day consume him entirely. As a young boy, Pedro roamed the streets barefoot, his stomach empty, his eyes always darting for a sign of food or shelter. The city was merciless, treating children like him as invisible, unwanted burdens that belonged more to the dirt than to society. Strangers ignored him, peers mocked him, and even those who could have shown kindness turned away. By the time he was only 8 years old, an incident with his mother would change his life forever. After she discovered him engaging in what she deemed a shameful act, she beat him savagely and cast him out of the house. That night, as the door closed behind him and he realized he no longer had a home to return to, Pedro López became a child of the streets, condemned to navigate a world that was already sharpening its claws for him on the streets. Predators were everywhere, and children like Pedro were easy prey. Alone, hungry, and desperate, he quickly became a target for men who saw him not as a child, but as something to exploit. He was kidnapped by strangers, locked away, and repeatedly abused in ways that shattered the innocence he had left. These encounters were not isolated moments of suffering, but recurring torments that scarred his psyche. Each attack stripped away pieces of his humanity, twisting his mind in ways even he could not yet comprehend. What was done to him in those dark alleys and hidden rooms would eventually become the blueprint of the horrors he inflicted later in life. A cycle of pain had been born, one in which the victim would evolve into a predator even more terrifying than those who once tormented him. But there were moments, fleeting and cruelly deceptive, when young Pedro thought he had found salvation. After months of wandering, he encountered a kind-hearted American couple who were working in Colombia. They took pity on the ragged boy and decided to adopt him, bringing him into their home and providing him with food, clothes, and shelter. For the first time in his life, Pedro felt the faint glow of love, a fragile spark of what family could be. He attended school, slept in a bed, and began to imagine a different kind of future. But fate, as if mocking him, refused to let him escape the darkness. This brief period of stability was violently cut short when he was kidnapped yet again by a stranger who lured him away. Whatever healing had begun was destroyed in an instant. Returned to the nightmare of abuse, the boy who had begun to taste. Hope was now submerged deeper into despair. His trust shattered forever. As Pedro grew older, he wandered from place to place, learning to survive by stealing, begging, and sometimes selling whatever scraps he could find. The world taught him that to survive, one must become harder, colder, and less human. He absorbed this lesson with terrifying precision. Each year that passed stripped away more of his childhood, replacing it with an emptiness that he filled with anger and perverse desires. By his teenage years, he no longer looked like the boy abandoned on the streets, but rather a shell molded by trauma, resentment, and rage. In his eyes burned something unsettling, a reflection of the cruelty he had endured and the cruelty he was beginning to imagine inflicting on others. The transformation from victim to predator had already begun, even if the world had not yet realized the danger he would one day represent. What makes this stage of Pedro Lopez's life so haunting is not just the suffering he endured, but the way that suffering fermented inside him, shaping his view of humanity. To him, innocence became something fragile, something he associated with vulnerability and exploitation, because his own innocence had been stolen so brutally. Instead of rejecting what was done to him, he internalized it, twisting it into a dark fantasy that he would later enact on countless others. The streets did not just teach him survival, they taught him how to hunt, how to stalk, how to find those even weaker than himself. With every night spent in hunger, with every beating, with every assault he suffered, he was learning not compassion, but cruelty. He was becoming the embodiment of the horrors he once endured. His early life is not an excuse for the atrocities he committed later, but it is impossible to ignore how the relentless torment of his childhood laid the foundation for the monster he became. The boy who was once small and frightened would grow into a man feared across nations. The abandoned child would become a predator who abandoned hundreds of young girls to shallow graves. The irony is as chilling as it is tragic. Society failed him as a boy, and in turn, he became the most brutal reminder of what happens when innocence is destroyed too soon. By the 1970s, the name Pedro Lopez was not yet infamous, but the shadows of his crimes had already begun to stretch across South America. In rural villages, in the narrow alleys of towns, and in the marketplaces where children wandered freely, whispers of missing girls slowly started to ripple through the communities. Families searched desperately, mothers clutched photographs, fathers wandered hillsides calling out names that would never again be answered. But to the authorities, these disappearances were barely worth a glance. Poverty-stricken families were ignored, their cries dismissed as exaggeration, their losses treated as though they were simply another tragedy in a land where tragedy was common. But for Lopez, this indifference was his shield, the silence that allowed him to stalk without fear of being caught. He had perfected his method. He was not a killer who relied on brute force or reckless violence to capture his victims. Instead, he played the role of the harmless stranger, the smiling man with promises that seemed innocent. In small villages where children often had little to look forward to, candy, a toy, or even the soft voice of someone who appeared kind could dissolve suspicion. He approached them on the roads, in the markets, or while they were playing near their homes, and with careful persuasion, he led them away. He knew how to lower his voice, how to crouch down to their level, how to make them feel safe enough to follow him. And once they did, their fate was sealed. Disappearances were terrifying in their regularity. A girl would be there one moment, her laughter echoing in the dusty air, and the next moment she was gone. At first, the parents thought perhaps their children had wandered off, perhaps they had been taken by someone they knew. But as the number of missing girls grew, panic began to spread. And yet, even as mothers wept and begged for help, the police shrugged, suggesting the girls had run away, ignoring the cries of families too poor to demand justice. For Lopez, this apathy was a gift. He operated in a world where the lives of these children were invisible to those in power. And he used this invisibility to fuel his hunt. He did not kill quickly. That was not his way. For Lopez, the act of luring and controlling was as important as the crime itself. He would charm them, walk with them, promise them gifts, and then lead them to isolated places where no one could hear their voices. In these moments, the fragile trust of a child was turned into a weapon against them. What makes his story more chilling is that he did not see these children as human beings, but as objects, symbols of innocence he wanted to corrupt, destroy, and discard. His past had twisted his perception so deeply that innocence itself became his obsession, and every victim was another reenactment of the violence done to him. In his youth, families began to notice the patterns. One by one, daughters from poor households vanished, usually around the ages of 8 to 12. These were not random disappearances but calculated choices. Lopez was deliberate in targeting children from the poorest families, those who had little protection and no voice to demand answers. The wealthier communities barely noticed what was happening, but in the rural villages, terror spread like wildfire. Parents no longer allowed their daughters to walk alone. Children were kept indoors, and fear soaked into the very air. And still, the disappearances continued, as though someone was mocking their precautions, as though the monster lived among them and could not be stopped. There were brief moments when suspicion arose, when villagers whispered about the strange man seen wandering too often near the marketplaces, but no one could pin down proof. He moved constantly, shifting between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, never staying in one place long enough for his face to become familiar. Borders in South America at the time were poorly controlled, and Lopez used this freedom to escape whenever suspicions grew too heavy. If a village became too alert, he would vanish into the next town, blending in again, beginning the cycle anew. He was a predator who understood not only his prey but the indifference of the world around him, and he manipulated both to his advantage. The number of victims grew, though the full scale of it was invisible at the time. For the families who lost daughters, it was the end of everything, a permanent wound carved into their lives. Mothers fell into grief, some losing their sanity, some never leaving their homes again. Fathers wandered for months through mountains and rivers, hoping to find at least the body of their child, hoping to bury them with dignity. But Lopez rarely left behind traces that could be followed. He was meticulous in ensuring his crimes disappeared with the same silence that the police gave to the victims' families. To him, every disappearance was not just another killing, but another step in building his legend. Though the world did not yet know his name, what made his reign of terror all the more effective was the cultural landscape of the time. South America in the 1970s was riddled with political turmoil, poverty, and widespread distrust of law enforcement. Police forces were often underpaid, undertrained, and uninterested in cases that did not involve wealthy families or political interests. A poor farmer's daughter going missing was of no concern to them. The absence of justice gave Lopez the freedom to operate almost like a ghost, and this lack of accountability emboldened him further. He was not simply hunting children. He was testing how far society would let him go. And with each crime ignored, his confidence grew. The horror of his crimes cannot be captured merely by numbers or by the descriptions of what he did to those girls. It lies in the silence that surrounded them, in the way their absences were treated as though they did not matter, in the way their mothers' cries went unanswered. It lies in the growing sense of dread that spread across entire regions, the whispered warnings between villagers, the feeling that an unseen predator was always near. Lopez thrived in this climate of fear, feeding off it, growing more daring, more calculating, more monstrous with each passing year. In 1980, in the bustling marketplace of Ambato, Ecuador, fate finally turned its gaze toward Pedro López. He had been wandering the streets as he had countless times before, eyes scanning the crowd not for food or trade, but for a victim. Stalls overflowed with fruits, textiles, and chatter, the air heavy with the smell of cooked maize and the cries of vendors calling for customers. It was the perfect place for him to blend in, to move unnoticed among families who had no idea. The deadliest predator of their generation was walking beside them. But this time something shifted. A mother, desperate after the disappearance of her daughter, had warned locals of a suspicious man seen hovering around children. When a vendor spotted Lopez coaxing the small girl with promises of gifts, he did not look away. He shouted, alerting others, and for the first time in years, the hunter was cornered, dragged to the police. Lopez appeared calm, almost eerily detached. He did not beg, did not deny, did not tremble. Instead, he watched the officers with the same cold stare he once used on his victims, as though their uniforms and authority meant nothing to him. When questioned, he did something that shocked even the most hardened investigators. He confessed. Not to one crime, not to 10, but to hundreds. His words fell with chilling precision as he described the disappearances of girls across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. He claimed he had killed over 300 children, an admission so staggering that at first the police thought he must be insane or lying. But as he recounted details only the true culprit could know, the sickening reality set in. They were face to face with a man who had orchestrated one of the deadliest killing sprees in history. The investigators listened, horrified, as Lopez explained his methods. He spoke not with remorse, but with a calm, almost clinical detachment, describing how he lured young girls with candy, toys, or kind words, leading them away to isolated places. He described how he gained their trust, how he watched their fear grow when they realized they were trapped, how he ended their lives with the same ease someone might recount a daily routine. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some leaving the room altogether, unable to listen. Yet Lopez continued, seemingly energized by the act of retelling, his voice steady, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling pride. For him, confession was not a burden but a performance, one in which he relished the horrified faces of those forced to hear him. The police decided to test his words, to see if this man was truly telling the truth or weaving fantasies of horror. They took him into the mountains and the remote plains where he claimed to have buried his victims. What followed was beyond their worst nightmares. Lopez led them directly to shallow graves, one after another, each revealing the remains of children whose families had searched in vain. With each discovery, the officer's skepticism dissolved into dread. The scale of his crimes became undeniable. He was not inventing stories. He was recounting reality. Every bone pulled from the earth was a testament to his monstrous confessions. Proof that the man they held in custody was indeed the monster of the Andes. Word of his capture spread like wildfire, first through Ambato, then across Ecuador, then into Colombia and Peru. Families who had lost daughters flocked to the authorities, desperate for answers, desperate to know if Lopez had been the one to take their children. Some begged for justice, others demanded to see him with their own eyes, hoping to find closure in confronting the man who had destroyed their lives. The public was gripped by horror as the scale of his crimes became clear. Newspapers painted him as a demon in human skin, an inhuman figure who had haunted their lands for years. Yet what terrified people most was not only the number of victims, but the coldness with which he admitted it. He was not haunted by nightmares. He was not burdened by guilt. To him, this was simply who he was. Psychologists were brought in to examine him, to try and understand the mind behind the monster. They found a man devoid of empathy, incapable of remorse, his thoughts dominated by twisted desires and obsessions. He spoke openly about his killings, as though describing the weather, his words stripped of any moral weight. He admitted to feeling satisfaction in the act, a satisfaction born not from rage or revenge, but from a warped sense of control and dominance. The experts realized they were not dealing with someone who could be rehabilitated, but with someone who embodied pure predation. Lopez himself even warned them, claiming that once released, he would kill again. His candor was not a cry for help, but a declaration of identity in the courtroom. The atmosphere was suffocating. Survivors' families filled the benches, their faces etched with grief and anger. The prosecutors laid out the evidence, recounting the confessions, the graves, the sheer enormity of the crimes. Lopez sat unmoved, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes staring blankly ahead. For the families, his composure was a final insult, a reminder that he would never feel the pain he had inflicted. The judge, overwhelmed by the weight of the case, declared him guilty, sentencing him to prison in Ecuador. But here too, the horror deepened. Because of legal limitations at the time, the maximum sentence for his crimes was only 16 years, a punishment far too small for the scale of his atrocities. While behind bars, Lopez continued to unsettle those around him. Other inmates feared him, guards kept their distance, and psychologists continued to struggle with the abyss of his mind. He sometimes spoke of his killings with a kind of nostalgia, as though reminiscing about past adventures. At other times, he hinted at his desire to kill again, reminding anyone who listened that his hunger had not been extinguished. For the families of his victims, this knowledge was a knife that never stopped twisting. They knew their daughter's murderer still lived, still breathed, still carried the same darkness that had stolen hundreds of young lives. The case of Pedro López became a grim reminder of how fragile justice could be in the face of true evil. His confession, his cold demeanor, the confirmation of his monstrous claims through the graves he revealed, all of it painted a portrait of a man unlike any other. He was not the raging, frenzied killer people expected, but something far worse. Calm, patient, methodical, a predator who walked unnoticed among crowds and struck with precision. He was proof that sometimes the most terrifying monsters were the most ordinary faces. Despite the staggering confessions and the evidence that proved his claims, the justice dealt to Pedro López was disturbingly inadequate. In Ecuador, the legal system at the time had no provision for life sentences or the death penalty. No matter how monstrous the crime, the maximum punishment was capped at 16 years. For a man who admitted to murdering more than 300 children, 16 years seemed like a cruel joke. Even worse, Lopez did not serve that full term. After 14 years in prison, he was released in 1994, declared rehabilitated by the very system that had failed to stop him for decades. The world watched in disbelief as the deadliest serial killer in recorded history walked out of prison. Free once again, his cold smile returning to the streets, he was handed over to Colombian authorities after his release. But once again, loopholes in the legal framework allowed him to slip through the cracks. In Colombia, he was briefly charged in connection with an old case, but the charges did not hold, and he was soon set free. At one point, he was even admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where doctors attempted to study him, to understand the monster beneath the skin. Yet after only a few years, he was declared sane and released once again. The thought that a man who openly confessed to one of the most horrifying crime sprees in history could be considered cured was almost as shocking as the crimes themselves. Families who had lost daughters wept, outraged, helpless to prevent what they knew could never be undone. After his release in Colombia, Pedro López disappeared from public records. Some reports claimed he vanished into the chaos of the Colombian countryside, blending in with the nameless millions, a ghost who had already proven his ability to walk unnoticed. Others whispered he might have returned to his old ways, preying on vulnerable children in areas where law enforcement had little reach. With every new disappearance in rural Colombia or Ecuador, whispers grew louder, with villagers asking whether the monster of the Andes had returned to hunt. Authorities offered no answers. His whereabouts became a mystery, and in that mystery lay the most haunting truth of all. No one knew if he was alive or dead, free or captured, killing again, or lying in an unmarked grave. The silence surrounding him was as terrifying as his presence ever was. The legacy he left behind was not just in the numbers, though the numbers themselves remain almost impossible to comprehend. It was in the way his story highlighted the failures of justice, the vulnerability of the poor, and the sheer cruelty of indifference. He preyed on the forgotten, the voiceless, those whose lives seemed to matter least to the authorities. His crimes were enabled by a system that looked away, by societies that could not protect their most vulnerable, by borders that allowed him to slip through unnoticed. He thrived because he understood that the lives of poor children were invisible to the world, and he exploited that invisibility until it became his weapon. For the families who lost their daughters, there was no closure. Many of them never even recovered the bodies of their loved ones, left to imagine the horrors their children endured in their final moments. Their grief became a wound that never healed, a reminder not only of the monster who took their daughters, but of the world that allowed him to do so. Some carried photographs of their children for the rest of their lives, worn and faded images of faces frozen in time, reminders of innocence stolen. They had no justice, no peace, only the endless question of why such evil was allowed to flourish. Pedro Lopez's story has since become legend, a grim tale told in hushed tones, a reminder that monsters are not confined to myths or nightmares. He was not a creature of fantasy, but a man who walked in daylight, who smiled, who spoke softly, who blended into the crowd. He was proof that evil can wear an ordinary face, that the most terrifying predators can hide in plain sight. To this day, his name strikes fear not because of what is known, but because of what remains unknown. How many more children might he have taken after his release? How many families might have suffered in silence, never realizing that the monster of the Andes had passed through their town? These questions hang in the air like a shadow that never fades. The case of Pedro López forces the world to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, morality, and humanity. It is a story not just of one man's evil, but of systemic failure, of indifference that turned tragedy into catastrophe. He was a product of violence and neglect, but he became something far worse, a predator who turned his pain into a weapon against hundreds of innocent lives. His story is a warning that monsters do not emerge from nowhere. They are often shaped by the cruelty of the world, and when ignored, they grow strong enough to consume it. And so the story of Pedro López ends not with certainty, but with haunting ambiguity. Officially, he remains one of the deadliest serial killers in recorded history, with more than 300 claimed victims and countless others who may never be known. Unofficially, his fate is a mystery, his existence a ghost story whispered among villagers, his name a reminder of terror. He may be dead, he may still walk the earth, but what is certain is the legacy he left behind. A legacy of fear, of grief, of unanswered questions, of justice denied. The monster of the Andes will forever remain etched into history, not only as a killer but as the embodiment of humanity's darkest failure. Proof that sometimes evil does not end when chains are broken, but when memory itself fades, leaving behind nothing but shadows and silence.